The Amber Crown, a Game of Thrones story. Act 1, The Gathering Storm. Chapter 1, The Bastard's Duty. The morning mist clung to the trident like a shroud, as Sir Aldwin Rivers adjusted his grip on his sword hilt. From his position atop the watchtower of Stonehenge, he could see the muddy waters winding through the riverlands, carrying with them whispers of war. The banners of House Bracken snapped in the wind above him, the red stallion on brown and green, but Aldwin's eyes were fixed on the horizon, watching for riders that might bring news from the south. "Sir Aldwin!" a voice called from below. Young Tomard, barely past his 15th name day, scrambled up the wooden steps with the graceless haste of youth. "Lord Bracken commands your presence in the great hall. There's been a raven." Aldwin nodded, his weathered face betraying nothing of the unease that had been growing in his chest for weeks. At 32, he had served House Bracken faithfully for 15 years, ever since Lord Jonos had taken pity on a bastard boy with skill at arms and no place to go. But faithfulness, he had learned, could be a complicated thing when the realm began to tear itself apart. The great hall of Stonehenge was darker than usual, the morning light struggling through windows that seemed smaller than they had the day before. Lord Jonos Bracken sat in his high seat, a man grown thick around the middle, but still dangerous in his bearing. To his right stood his eldest son and heir, Sir Hendry, whose hand rested on his sword pommel with the casual confidence of a man who had never known defeat. The Maester, Qyburn's predecessor Donnell, stood beside them with a raven scroll in his weathered hands. Rivers?" Lord Bracken said, using the bastard surname that marked Aldwin as surely as a brand. "Read this." Aldwin took the scroll, his eyes scanning the carefully penned words. The message was brief but troubling. Strange ships bearing Braavosi colors observed landing cargo at Maidenpool under cover of darkness. Nature of cargo unknown. Guard increased. Signed, Sir Willem Mouton. "Bravos," Aldwin said, handing the scroll back. "What business would the Iron Bank have with smugglers' work?" Maester Donnell cleared his throat, a sound like parchment rustling. "Perhaps not the Iron Bank, Sir Aldwin. The Free Cities have many interests, and not all of them involve coin." Lord Bracken leaned forward in his chair. "The realm grows restless. Prince Rhaegar's indiscretion has set tongues wagging from Dorne to the Wall, and now we have Braavosi ships sneaking about our coasts like thieves." He paused, his eyes fixing on Aldwin with the weight of years of service between them. "Tell me, Rivers, where do your loyalties lie?" It was a question Aldwin had been dreading, though he had known it would come eventually. The Mad King's crimes were whispered about in every tavern and holdfast, and Prince Rhaegar's abduction of Lyanna Stark had lit a fire that threatened to consume the Seven Kingdoms. But Lord Bracken had sworn oaths to the Iron Throne, and House Bracken's banners would be expected to answer the king's call. "My loyalties lie with House Bracken, my lord," Aldwin said carefully, "as they have since you took me into your service." "Good man," Lord Bracken said, but there was something in his eyes that suggested the answer had not entirely satisfied him. "But these are times when a man's oath to his liege lord might conflict with his duty to the realm. The Tullys have not yet declared for either side, though there are whispers that Hoster Tully favors the rebels. If he calls his banners against the crown, then we follow our rightful lord," Sir Hendry interjected, his voice carrying the certainty of youth. "House Bracken has served the realm faithfully for 300 years. We'll not break faith now for some northern lord's wounded pride." Aldwin said nothing, but he caught Maester Donnell's eye for just a moment. The old man's expression was carefully neutral, but Aldwin had known him long enough to read the concern there. Whatever the Maester had learned from his ravens and scrolls, it had not brought him comfort. "There's more," Lord Bracken continued. "Lord Titus Blackwood has been seen riding the bounds of his lands with a larger escort than usual. Old grudges die hard, and if this realm tears itself apart, he may see it as an opportunity to settle scores. I want you to increase the patrols along our borders rivers, and if you see anything unusual, I want to know of it immediately." "Of course, my lord." As the meeting dispersed, Aldwin lingered near the great hearth, ostensibly warming his hands, but actually watching Maester Donnell organize his scrolls with unusual care. When they were alone, the old man approached him. "Walk with me, Sir Aldwin," Donald said quietly. "There are matters we should discuss, away from eager ears." They made their way to the Maester's tower, a cramped space filled with books, bottles, and the accumulated knowledge of 40 years of service. Donald closed the door behind them and activated a small brass lock, an unusual precaution. "You're troubled," Aldwin observed. "As should you be." Donnell moved to his desk, where several scrolls lay open. "That message from Maidenpool was not the only raven I received this morning. There have been disturbing reports from the Citadel." Aldwin waited, knowing the old man would speak when he was ready. "The Archmaesters are concerned about the king's state of mind," Donnell continued. "There are whispers of wildfire, great quantities of it being moved through King's Landing, and there are rumors that His Grace speaks of burning his enemies, all of them, should they dare approach his throne." "Wildfire," Aldwin repeated. The alchemist's substance was fearsome enough in small quantities. The thought of the Mad King wielding it like a weapon sent a chill through him. But that's not the most troubling news. Donnell picked up another scroll, this one bearing a different seal. "I have contacts among my fellow Maesters, men I studied with in my youth. They tell me that the Citadel itself has been compromised." "Compromised how?" "Gold, Sir Aldwin. Rivers of gold flowing through Old Town's banking houses, some of it finding its way to both sides of this growing conflict. The Citadel claims neutrality, but neutrality can be profitable if managed correctly." Aldwin felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of knowledge that could not be unknown. "And Lord Bracken? Does he know?" "Lord Bracken knows what he chooses to know," Donnell said with the weary cynicism of a man who had served lords for most of his life. "He sees an opportunity to prove his loyalty to the crown, and perhaps earn royal favor. But you and I both know that in times like these, loyalty can be as dangerous as treachery." A knock at the door interrupted them. "Maester Donnell!" It was Tomard's voice, breathless with excitement. "Another raven, sir, from River Run." Donnell opened the door and took the scroll, breaking Hoster Tully's seal with practiced efficiency. His face grew grave as he read. "What is it?" Aldwin asked. "Lord Tully calls for a gathering of his bannermen," Donowillo said slowly. "In 3 days' time. He requests that they come prepared to discuss the realm's future in these troubled times." They looked at each other in silence, both understanding what those careful words meant. The Riverlands were being asked to choose sides, and the time for neutrality was ending. "I should inform Lord Bracken," Donnell said finally. "Aye," Aldwin agreed, "though I wonder if he'll see it as the summons it truly is, or merely another lord's request for counsel." As they made their way back toward the great hall, Aldwin caught sight of movement on the road leading to Stonehenge. A small party of riders approached under a banner he didn't immediately recognize, not Bracken, not Blackwood, but something else. As they drew closer, he could make out the device, a tree and ravens on a field of brown and orange. "Smallwood," he murmured to himself. A minor house, but one with connections throughout the Riverlands. What brought them to Stonehenge on this of all days? He would have his answer soon enough, but something told him that whatever news Lord Smallwood brought, it would only add to the growing storm that threatened to engulf them all. Chapter 2. The Marriage Bargain. Lady Mira Smallwood had always prided herself on her ability to read the currents of politics as easily as a sailor reads wind and tide. But as her father's small procession approached the gates of Stonehenge, She found herself struggling to navigate waters that seemed to shift with each passing league. At 19, Mira possessed the kind of beauty that was considered appropriate for a lord's daughter. Auburn hair that caught the light, green eyes that missed little, and a figure that was pleasing without being scandalous. More importantly, she possessed a mind that could see 3 moves ahead in any game of politics. A gift that had made her invaluable to her father's ambitions and, she suspected, was about to make her life considerably more complicated. "Remember," Lord Smallwood said as they passed beneath the portcullis, "this marriage serves not just our house, but the stability of the realm. Sir Donald Vypren is a good man, loyal to the crown, with lands that border our own. The match makes sense." Mira nodded dutifully, though privately she wondered if anything made sense anymore. The realm felt like a pot set to boil, and her father seemed determined to thrust their small house directly into the steam. The courtyard of Stonehenge bustled with activity more than usual, she noted. Extra guards walked the walls, and there was a tension in the air that spoke of preparations for something more serious than a simple wedding negotiation. Lord Bracken himself emerged from the great hall to greet them, flanked by his son and a tall, weathered man Mira didn't recognize, but whose bearing marked him as a knight. "Lord Smallwood," Bracken said warmly, though Mira caught the calculating look in his eyes as they swept over her father's modest retinue. "Welcome to Stonehenge. I trust your journey was pleasant." "Pleasant enough, though the roads seem less safe than they once were," her father replied. "We passed 2 merchant caravans with armed escorts, more swords than goods from the look of it." "Troubling times call for troubling precautions," Bracken agreed. "Come, let us speak in private. There is much to discuss beyond the happy matter of your daughter's betrothal." As the lords moved toward the great hall, Mira found herself momentarily alone in the courtyard. It was then that she noticed the servant girl approaching her, a young woman perhaps her own age, but with the cautious manner of someone who had learned to listen more than she spoke. "My lady," the girl said with a curtsy, "I'm Dara. Lord Bracken has asked me to see to your comfort during your stay. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your chambers." Mira followed Dara through corridors she remembered from childhood visits, though they seemed somehow smaller and more oppressive now. As they walked, she caught fragments of conversation from aside chambermen's voices, speaking in the low, urgent tones of conspiracy. Ships at Maidenpool. Not just gold, but men, trained men. If Tully calls the banners... She slowed her pace, straining to hear more, but Dara had noticed her distraction. "Careful, my lady," the girl said quietly. "Stone walls have long ears, and some conversations are dangerous to overhear." There was something in the girl's tone that made Mira look at her more carefully. Dara's clothes marked her as a servant, but her speech was too refined, her posture too confident. And there was intelligence in her eyes, the kind that came from breeding, not training. "You're not really a servant, are you?" Mira said when they reached the privacy of her assigned chambers. Dara closed the door behind them and smiled, an expression that transformed her entirely. "Clever. No, my lady, I'm not. Though I've found that servants see and hear things that noble ladies are often blind to." "Then what are you?" "Someone who shares your interest in the conversations happening inside chambers," Dara said. "Someone who knows that your betrothal to Sir Donald Vypren is about more than securing your father's lands." Mira felt her heart quicken. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Sir Donnell is one of several young knights who have been meeting quietly with certain lords who remain enthusiastic about King Eris's rule. They call themselves the King's True Men, though they're careful not to use that name where others might hear it." The pieces began falling into place in Mira's mind. "My father isn't just securing an alliance. He's choosing sides." "Your father is choosing what he believes is the winning side," Dara corrected. "The question is whether you'll choose to help him, or whether you'll choose to help the realm." Before Mira could respond, A commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention to the window. A new party of riders had arrived, these bearing banners Mira didn't recognize, black and red, with a device she couldn't make out at this distance. "Sellswords," Dara observed. "The Golden Company, unless I'm mistaken. Interesting that they should arrive just as your betrothal is being negotiated." "The Golden Company fights for the Targaryens," Mira said, her political education serving her well. "Some of them do. Others fight for whoever pays the most gold." Dara turned from the window. "But there's something else you should know. Something I overheard at the wedding feast preparations. The cooks have been instructed to prepare for additional guests who will arrive after dark and leave before dawn. Secret guests. Very secret. And very important, I suspect." Dara moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My lady, I'm going to tell you something that could get us both killed. There's a girl, a bastard girl, who escaped King's Landing 3 days ago. The daughter of Brandon Stark, though few know she exists. She carries something that could tip the balance of this war before it truly begins." Mira's mind raced. A bastard daughter of Brandon Stark would have been born before his marriage, hidden away to prevent scandal. But if she had been in King's Landing when the Mad King ordered Brandon's arrest, she knows something, Mira said. Something about what happened to her father. Something about what's going to happen to everyone else, Dara corrected. And tonight, she's going to be here at Stonehenge asking for help that could damn us all. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor made them both fall silent. Dara quickly moved to unpack Mira's traveling clothes, resuming her role as a servant just as someone knocked on the door. "Lady Mira," it was her father's voice. "The betrothal feast is beginning. It's time." Mira smoothed her skirts and checked her reflection in the polished metal mirror. The young woman looking back at her seemed unchanged, but she felt as though everything had shifted in the space of a single conversation. Tonight, she would pledge herself to a man she barely knew, in service to a king she was beginning to suspect was mad, while secret messages passed between men who spoke of loyalty but dealt in gold and blood. "I'm ready, father," she called, though she had never felt less ready for anything in her life. As she left the chamber, Dara caught her eye one last time. "Remember, my lady," the girl said quietly, "in the Game of Thrones, the most dangerous move is often the one that looks like surrender." The betrothal feast was already underway when Mira entered the great hall, her arm linked with her father's. The hall had been decorated with banners and flowers, but beneath the celebration, she could sense the undercurrents of tension. Lords and knights clustered in small groups, their conversations too quiet and too intense for a wedding feast. Sir Donald Vypren rose as she approached the high table. He was handsome enough, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy smile that came naturally to men who had never been denied anything they wanted. But as he took her hand and pressed it to his lips, Mira found herself studying his eyes. They were blue and bright, but there was something cold in their depths, something that made her think of winter frost on a still pond. "Lady Mira," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "you honor me with your beauty and your father's trust. I swear to you, before these witnesses, that I will be a true and faithful husband." The expected words, spoken with the expected cadence. But as Mira murmured her own response, she caught sight of movement near the servants' entrance. Men in dark cloaks, moving with the fluid grace of professionals, had entered the hall and were making their way toward a side chamber. None of the other guests seemed to notice them, but Mira's eyes tracked their progress with growing unease. The feast continued around her, courses of roasted meat and fine wine, toasts to her health and happiness, music that seemed too loud and too cheerful for the mood that hung over the gathering like smoke. But Mira's attention was divided between maintaining the proper responses to the celebration and watching the subtle dramas playing out around her. She noticed how Lord Bracken's eyes kept drifting to the side chamber where the cloaked men had disappeared. She saw how certain knights excused themselves at regular intervals, always in pairs, always returning with grim expressions. And she became increasingly aware of how often Sir Donnell's hand found reasons to touch her. Her shoulder, her wrist, the small of her back, each contact lasting just a moment longer than courtesy required. It was during the third course that she heard it, a phrase that chilled her more than the evening air seeping through the hall's great windows. The northern girl should arrive within the hour. The words came from behind her, spoken by one knight to another, in the kind of whisper that was meant to be private, but carried just far enough to be overheard. Mira kept her expression neutral, laughing at something Sir Donnell was saying, but her mind was racing. The northern girl, the bastard daughter of Brandon Stark. She was coming here, to Stonehenge, tonight. And from the tension in the hall, from the presence of sellswords and the secret meetings, Mira was beginning to understand that her betrothal feast was nothing more than convenient cover for something far more dangerous. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed more freely, conversations grew less guarded. Mira heard fragments about the realm's future and difficult choices ahead. She heard Sir Donnell and several other young knights discussing something they called the King's Justice, in tones that suggested they relished the prospect of delivering it. But it was what she overheard from the servants' gallery that truly frightened her. Two men, speaking in accents she didn't recognize, foreign, perhaps Essosi discussing ships and cargo, and something about the weapon from Cahors. A weapon, foreign ships, secret meetings, and somewhere in the darkness beyond Stonehenge's walls, a bastard girl carried knowledge that men were willing to kill for. Mira excused herself from the high table, claiming a need for air, and made her way to a small balcony that overlooked the castle's inner courtyard. The night was clear, the stars bright enough to cast shadows, and in that pale light she could see figures moving with purpose between buildings. Preparations for something. But what? Beautiful night for a wedding celebration. Mira turned to find Dara, or whoever she really was, standing in the doorway behind her. Though I suspect, the girl continued, stepping onto the balcony and closing the door behind her, that celebrations are the furthest thing from your mind right now. Tell me what's really happening here, Mira said. Or, Dara replied simply, though most of the men in that hall don't know it yet. Your betrothal to Sir Donnell isn't just about securing alliances. It's about ensuring that when the realm tears itself apart, certain people are on the winning side. And the northern girl? Brandon Stark's daughter? She's the match that could light the fire, Dara said. She escaped King's Landing with proof of things that could turn lords who might otherwise hesitate. But she's also walking into a trap, because there are people in that hall who would rather see her dead than let her message spread. Mira felt the weight of choice settling on her shoulders. In a few hours, she would be betrothed to a man who served a mad king. Her father would have his alliance, and their small house would be secure, as long as they chose correctly. But the girl approaching Stonehenge through the darkness carried truth that might save the realm, even if it doomed them all. What do you want from me? She asked. I want you to decide, Dara said, whether you're going to be Lady Mira Vypren, dutiful wife to a king's man, or whether you're going to be something more dangerous. Before Mira could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the courtyard. A single rider, approaching fast, and even from the balcony she could see that the horse was lathered with sweat, and the rider swayed with exhaustion. The northern girl had arrived, and with her arrival, everything was about to change. Act 2. Divided Loyalties. Chapter 3. The Northern Girl. The great hall of Stonehenge had settled into the comfortable haze of a successful feast when the commotion began. Mira, having returned from the balcony with Dara's words still echoing in her mind, watched as Lord Bracken rose abruptly from his seat, his attention fixed on something beyond the hall's main entrance. The conversations around her died to whispers, then silence, as every guest became aware that something momentous was occurring. Sir Aldwin Rivers appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grim with purpose. Behind him walked a figure that made Mira's breath catch in her throat. A young woman, perhaps 20 years of age, with the dark hair and gray eyes of the north. Her clothes were travel-stained, and her cloak bore the mud of hard riding, but she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of noble blood, bastard-born or not. "My lords," Aldwin announced, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent hall, "I present Lysa Snow, daughter of a friend to House Stark." The careful phrasing fooled no one. Every person in that hall understood exactly whose bastard daughter stood before them, and what her presence meant. Mira caught sight of Sir Donnell's face and felt a chill at the cold calculation she saw there. Lord Bracken descended from the high table, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Lady Lysa," he said, the title a diplomatic courtesy, "you honor Stonehenge with your presence, though I confess your arrival is unexpected." Lysa Snow, for that was surely who she was, met his gaze without flinching. "My lord, I come bearing news that cannot wait for more convenient times. The realm faces dangers that go beyond the grievances between king and lords." "Indeed?" Lord Bracken's tone remained neutral, but Mira noticed how his eyes flicked briefly toward the side chamber where the cloaked men had disappeared earlier. "Perhaps we might discuss these matters in private. The celebration of my young friend's betrothal is hardly the place for—" "The betrothal is precisely why I'm here," Lysa interrupted, her voice carrying a strength that made several knights reach instinctively for their sword hilts. "Because the man she's about to wed, and others like him, are part of a conspiracy that reaches from King's Landing to the Free Cities." The hall erupted. Sir Donnell shot to his feet, his hand on his weapon, while Lord Smallwood's face went pale with shock and growing anger. But it was Maester Donnell who surprised everyone by stepping forward, his aged voice cutting through the chaos. "Let her speak," the old Maester said firmly. "If she bears witness to conspiracy, we are duty-bound to hear it." Lysa reached into her travel-stained cloak and withdrew a leather satchel, bound with wax seals, that even at a distance Mira could see bore important markings. 3 days ago, I escaped King's Landing with documents stolen from the chambers of Grand Maester Pykeli. Documents that prove certain lords have been in communication with agents of Volantis and Lys, arranging for weapons and gold to flow to those who would keep the Mad King on his throne. She held up a scroll, its seal broken but still recognizable. "This is a letter from Sir Donnell Viprin to a weaponsmith in Qohor, commissioning blades treated with a poison that leaves no trace. Blades intended for a very specific purpose." Sir Donnell's face had gone from pale to flushed with rage. "You dare bring false documents to this sacred feast? You dare!" "The seals are genuine," Maester Donnell said quietly, his eyes fixed on the scroll in Lysa's hands. "I can verify them." "As can I," said a new voice from the entrance to the hall. Every head turned to see Captain Jorik of the Golden Company striding into the hall, but he was not alone. Behind him walked a man in the robes of a Braavosi merchant, and behind him came others men whose presence here suddenly made terrible sense. "Captain Jorik," Lord Bracken said carefully, "I wasn't expecting—" "No, you weren't," Jorik replied, his sellsword's directness cutting through the diplomatic niceties, "because you thought the Golden Company was here to support your little conspiracy. But gold flows both ways, my lord, and we've received a more interesting offer." The Braavosi stepped forward, his purple-dyed beard marking him as a man of considerable wealth. "I am Tycho Nestoris of the Iron Bank," he announced, his accented voice carrying easily across the hall. And I bring word that certain debts have come due. Mira felt the world shifting around her. Political currents she had only barely understood, suddenly revealing themselves in all their complexity. The secret cargo at Maidenpool, the foreign ships, the mysterious meetings, it was all connected, and the web was larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. "The Iron Bank has no business in Westerosi affairs," Lord Smallwood said, his voice tight with growing panic. "The Iron Bank has business wherever gold flows," Nestoris replied smoothly, "and gold has been flowing very freely indeed, from King's Landing to Lys, from Lys to Qohor, from Qohor to certain lords who believed they could buy their way to victory." Lysa took advantage of the confusion to step closer to the high table. "The conspiracy goes deeper than poison blades," she said, her voice urgent. "Jon Arryn has been negotiating in secret with Prince Doran of Dorne. The Dornish are willing to join the rebellion, but they need proof that the lords who remain loyal to the king are not just mad, but treasonous." "Proof like this?" She held up another document, this one bearing a seal that made Lord Bracken go rigid with shock. "A letter from you, my lord, to an agent in Volantis, requesting that sellsword companies be hired to eliminate troublesome lords who might oppose the king, including your own liege lord, Hoster Tully." The silence that followed was so complete that Mira could hear the torches crackling in their sconces. Then Lord Bracken began to laugh, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever. "Clever girl," he said, his voice carrying a new edge of menace. "Very clever, but not quite clever enough." He gestured, and suddenly the hall was full of armed men, not just Bracken soldiers, but sellswords who had been hidden among the guests, disguised as servants and musicians. Steel rang as swords cleared their sheaths, and Mira found herself looking down a dozen blade points. "You see," Lord Bracken continued conversationally, "I've been preparing for this moment for some time. The realm is indeed about to tear itself apart, and I intend to be on the winning side when the dust settles, but that requires eliminating certain complications." Sir Aldwyn, Mira noticed, had not drawn his sword. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his eyes moving constantly, calculating odds and distances. Whatever choice he was about to make, he was taking his time to make it carefully. "The documents are genuine," Lysa said, her voice steady despite the weapons trained on her. "Even if you kill me, others know. The truth is already spreading." "Perhaps," Lord Bracken agreed, "but dead bastards tell no tales, and tragic accidents do happen. Sellswords attack a peaceful betrothal feast. Everyone dies defending themselves. Very sad, but such are the times we live in." It was then that Sir Donald made his mistake. Perhaps emboldened by the swords surrounding them, perhaps simply too arrogant to control himself, he stepped forward with his blade drawn. "I'll cut the lies from her throat myself," he snarled, raising his weapon toward Lysa. And that was when Sir Aldwyn moved. The bastard knight's sword cleared its sheath in a motion so fluid it seemed like water flowing uphill. Sir Donald's blade, aimed at Lysa's throat, instead met River's steel with a ringing crash that echoed through the hall like a bell tolling. "I think not," Aldwyn said quietly. The hall erupted into chaos. Steel clashed against steel, as men who had been sharing wine moments before now sought to spill each other's blood. Mira found herself pulled behind an overturned table by Dara, who had produced a long dagger from somewhere and was using it with professional competence. "Stay down!" Dara shouted over the din of battle. "This is about to get much worse!" She was right. Captain Jorek and his sellswords had joined the fight, but they were outnumbered by Bracken's men and the hidden blades he had stationed throughout the hall. Worse, the doors had been barred from the outside. Someone had planned this very carefully indeed. Through the melee, Mira caught glimpses of individual combats. Sir Aldwyn fought with the skill of a man who had spent his life proving himself worthy, his blade dancing through patterns of attack and defense that kept both Sir Donnell and 2 other knights at bay. Lysa Snow had somehow acquired a weapon and was holding her own near the hearth, her northern training evident in every move. But it was Maester Donnell who surprised everyone. The old man had retreated to his scrolls and books, but instead of cowering, he was doing something with powders and vials that sent up clouds of choking smoke. Whatever alchemical knowledge he possessed, he was putting it to deadly use. "The side door!" Dara grabbed Mira's arm and pointed through the smoke. "If we can reach it." An explosion of sound and fury cut her off as the main doors of the hall burst inward. New fighters poured into the chaos, but these bore the colors of House Tully, the silver trout on red and blue. At their head rode a knight Mira recognized from tournament tales, Sir Brynden Tully, the Blackfish himself. "In the name of Lord Hoster Tully and the rightful lords of the realm," Brynden's voice boomed across the hall. "Yield, and you'll be granted the king's justice. Resist and face the consequences." The tide of battle shifted instantly. Lord Bracken's conspiracy had depended on secrecy and surprise, but the arrival of Tully soldiers meant that secrecy was lost and surprise belonged to his enemies. One by one, his men began throwing down their weapons, but Lord Bracken himself was not finished. Even as his guards surrendered around him, he had managed to corner Lysa Snow near the great fireplace, his sword at her throat. "Stand back!" he shouted, his face twisted with desperate rage. "Stand back, or the bastard dies!" The hall fell silent, except for the crackle of flames and the labored breathing of wounded men. Every eye was fixed on the tableau by the Hearth Lord Bracken, with his blade pressed to Lysa's neck, her grey eyes defiant even in the face of death. It was Sir Aldwin who broke the standoff, but not in the way anyone expected. "My lord," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, "you've taught me much about loyalty over the years, about service and duty and the bonds between lord and man." He stepped forward slowly, his sword lowered but ready. "But you never taught me that loyalty could require dishonor. You never taught me that duty could mean betraying everything the realm stands for." "Rivers," Lord Bracken warned, pressing the blade closer to Lysa's throat. "Remember your place." "I am," Aldwin replied. "For the first time in my life, I truly am." With that, he moved, not toward Lord Bracken, but toward the great banner hanging behind the high seat, the red stallion of House Bracken that had flown over Stonehenge for 3 centuries. His sword swept up in a precise arc, severing the ropes that held it aloft. The heavy banner fell like a curtain, momentarily obscuring Lord Bracken from view. In that instant of confusion, Lysa twisted away from his blade, while Sir Brynden's crossbow bolt took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his sword clattering across the stone floor. Lord Bracken fell to his knees, his grand conspiracy reduced to nothing more than a middle-aged lord bleeding on his own hearthstones. Around him, the last of his men were surrendering, and the hall that had begun the evening as a celebration was ending it as a battlefield. Mira found herself staring at the fallen banner of House Bracken, its red stallion now trampled underfoot by the boots of Tully soldiers. Everything had changed in the space of a single evening, alliances shattered, conspiracies revealed, and choices made that could never be undone. "Lady Mira." Lysa Snow approached her, the bastard girl's face grim but not unkind. "I fear your betrothal feast has ended somewhat differently than planned." Mira looked around the hall, at her father, pale and shaken as he realized how close he had come to disaster, at Sir Donnell, now bound and under guard, at the documents scattered across the floor that would reshape the political landscape of the 7 kingdoms. "Yes," she said finally, "I rather think it has." But even as she spoke, she was already thinking ahead. already calculating what these revelations meant for the war that was coming. Because if one thing had become clear during the night's chaos, it was that the Game of Thrones had rules far more complex than she had ever imagined, and the stakes far higher than she had ever dared to dream. Chapter 4. The Maester's Gambit. In the grey dawn that followed the chaos at Stonehenge, Maester Donal sat in his tower chamber, surrounded by scattered papers, broken vials, and the acrid smell of alchemical smoke that still clung to his robes. His hands, normally steady from decades of mixing potions and copying texts, trembled slightly as he broke the seal on a raven scroll that had arrived with the morning light. The message was brief but chilling. Your activities at Stonehenge have been noted. The grey rats have long tails. Choose your loyalties carefully. A friend. Donal set the scroll aside and reached for his wine cup, only to find it empty. The events of the previous night had shaken him more deeply than he cared to admit. Not because of the violence — he had lived through Robert's rebellion and seen his share of bloodshed — but because of what the violence had revealed. The documents Lysa Snow had carried from King's Landing were genuine. He had verified the seals, studied the handwriting, analyzed the paper and ink. More troubling still were the financial records that Captain Jorek had provided, detailing payments that flowed through Old Town's banking houses like a hidden river of corruption. The Citadel, the great repository of knowledge and learning that had shaped his entire life, was compromised. Not by enemies from outside, but by the slow rot of gold and ambition from within. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, expecting to find one of the keep's servants, or perhaps Sir Aldwyn, seeking answers to questions that had no comfortable responses. Instead, he found himself facing a young man he didn't recognize, tall, lean, with the kind of unremarkable features that would blend into any crowd. But his eyes were sharp with intelligence, and the way he moved spoke of training that went beyond what any ordinary traveler would possess. "Maester Donal," the stranger said, closing the door behind him with practiced care. "My name is Qyburn. I believe we have much to discuss." Donal felt his blood chill. Qyburn, he knew that name from correspondence with the Citadel, from whispered conversations among Maesters who dealt with the darker aspects of their calling. A brilliant student who had been expelled for experiments deemed too dangerous, too unethical, for even the grey rats to tolerate. "What do you want?" Donal asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the small knife he kept for cutting parchment. Qyburn smiled, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "I want what you want, Maester. The truth. Though I suspect we may differ on what should be done with it once we find it." He moved to the window, gazing out at the courtyard, where Tully soldiers were still questioning prisoners from the previous night's conflict. "Tell me, what do you know about the Faceless Men of Braavos?" The question was so unexpected that Donal almost laughed. Death cultists who worship their many-faced god by becoming no one? Legends and sailors' tales, mostly. "Not legends," Qyburn said softly. "Very real, and very much involved in the current crisis. You see, the Iron Bank doesn't just lend gold. It ensures its investments are protected. And when a realm begins to tear itself apart, sometimes that protection requires specialized intervention." He turned from the window, his pale eyes fixing on Donal with uncomfortable intensity. 3 Maesters have died in the past month. Natural deaths, according to the Citadel's records. Heart failure, a fall downstairs, a tragic accident with poorly mixed chemicals. But I've examined the bodies, Maester Donal. I know what faceless men's work looks like. Donal felt the walls of his familiar world shifting around him like a house built on sand. "You're saying the Citadel is being infiltrated? That Maesters are being murdered and replaced?" "I'm saying that war makes everyone reassess their loyalties," Qyburn replied. "The Iron Bank has decided that King Aerys is a poor investment. But rather than simply calling in their debts, they've chosen a more subtle approach. Replace key figures, manipulate information, ensure that when the realm stabilizes, it does so in a configuration favorable to Braavosi interests. The implications hit Donnell like a physical blow. If Meisters were being replaced by trained killers and spies, then everything he thought he knew about the Citadel's neutrality was a lie. Worse, it meant that some of his fellow Meisters men he had known for decades might not be who they appeared to be. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because you're not corrupted yet," Qyburn said simply. "Your reaction last night, using your alchemical knowledge to level the playing field, showed me that you're still capable of independent action. And because I need someone inside the Citadel's information network. You want me to spy on my own brothers? I want you to help me identify which of your brothers are still actually your brothers," Qyburn corrected. "The Faceless Men are skilled, but they're not perfect. They can change their faces, but they can't change their knowledge. A man who has spent 40 years studying healing arts will know things that a killer trained in Braavos simply cannot fake." Donnell moved to his desk, where several scrolls lay open correspondence with Meisters throughout the Seven Kingdoms, reports on everything from crop yields to unusual weather patterns. Routine communications that suddenly seemed pregnant with hidden meaning. "How would I tell?" he asked reluctantly. Qyburn smiled, and this time there was something almost genuine in the expression. "Ask them about their first year at the Citadel, about the masters who taught them, the friends they made, the mistakes they committed while learning to forge their chains, personal details that wouldn't be in any official record." He produced a small vial from his robes, filled with a liquid that seemed to shift colors in the morning light. "And if you suspect someone has been replaced, a few drops of this in their wine will reveal the truth. It's a compound of my own devising, harmless to normal men, but it reacts poorly with certain preparations the Faceless Men use to maintain their disguises." Donnell stared at the vial, understanding that accepting it would mark him as a conspirator in games far more dangerous than anything he had imagined. But the alternative, allowing the Citadel to be corrupted from within while the realm burned around it, seemed even worse. "There's more," Qyburn continued. "The wildfire I mentioned last night, the Mad King's growing obsession with burning his enemies, that's not madness. It's influence. Someone has been feeding Eris information about the explosive properties of wildfire, encouraging his paranoia, pushing him toward decisions that will justify the very rebellion that threatens his throne." "Someone in the Citadel," Donnell said, the pieces falling into place. "Someone who wears the robes and chain of a Meister, certainly. Whether that person is who he claims to be..." Qyburn shrugged. "That's what we need to determine." A commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention back to the window. Lysa Snow was preparing to depart, her saddlebags packed with the documents she had risked her life to carry. But she was not leaving alone. Sir Aldwyn was mounting his own horse, clearly intending to escort her. "Interesting," Qyburn murmured. "The bastard knight chooses exile over a traitor's pardon." Donnell watched as Aldwyn secured his few possessions to his saddle. The previous night had cost the man everything, his position, his home, his future, but his shoulders were straight, and his movements confident. Whatever choice he had made, he was at peace with it. "Where will they go?" Donnell asked. "North, most likely, to find Jon Arryn and deliver proof of the Dornish alliance Lysa mentioned. If Prince Doran can be convinced to join the rebellion openly..." Qyburn shook his head. "Well, it would change everything. The war that's coming would be over before it truly began." Below them, Lord Smallwood was speaking urgently with Sir Brynden Tully, clearly trying to distance himself from the conspiracy his daughter's betrothal had nearly entangled him in. Mira stood nearby, her face composed, but her eyes calculating as she listened to the political maneuvering that would determine her family's fate. "And what of the girl?" Qyburn asked, following Donnell's gaze. Lady Mira proved herself quite resourceful last night. It would be a shame to waste such talent. She's young, Donald said, and untested. Youth can be an advantage, Qyburn replied. The young are more willing to take risks that their elders would consider foolish. And in the game we're about to play, a certain amount of foolishness may be required. He moved toward the door, then paused. I'll be in touch, Meister. Through ravens, through intermediaries, through whatever means present themselves. But remember, trust no one completely. The faceless men are very good at becoming the people you most want to trust. After he left, Donnell remained at his window, watching as the last of the night's prisoners were loaded onto carts for transport to River Run. The sun was climbing higher, burning away the morning mist, but the shadows in his tower chamber seemed deeper than ever. The vial Qyburn had left sat on his desk like an accusation. Beside it lay the Raven Scroll with its cryptic warning about gray rats and long tails. And scattered around both were the routine communications that now seemed anything but routine letters from Meisters he had known for decades, reports from strongholds across the Seven Kingdoms, the ordinary business of the Citadel that might hide extraordinary treachery. Donnell reached for a fresh piece of parchment and began to write. Not an official communication, but a personal letter to an old friend, Meister Cresson of Dragonstone, a man he had studied with in their youth. He would ask about their shared memories, about details that only the real Cresson would know. And depending on the answer he received, he paused in his writing, quill hovering over the parchment, as he realized the true scope of what Qyburn was asking him to do. If the Citadel was truly compromised, if Meisters throughout the Seven Kingdoms had been replaced by faceless men, then the very foundations of knowledge and learning in Westeros were under attack. The Grey Rats, as they called themselves with ironic pride, had always claimed to serve the realm above all else. But what happened when the realm itself was threatened not by armies or dragons, but by an enemy that could wear any face, speak with any voice, and poison the very wells of truth from which all wisdom flowed? Donnell dipped his quill in ink and continued writing. Whatever the cost, whatever the danger, he would find the truth. Because if he didn't, there might not be a realm left to serve when the game of faces finally ended. In the courtyard below, Lysa Snow and Sir Aldwyn rode through the gates of Stonehenge, carrying with them secrets that could topple kings. And in his tower above, an old Meister began the most dangerous investigation of his life, armed with nothing but his wits, his knowledge, and a small vial of poison that could reveal the faces behind the faces. The Game of Thrones had always been about power, but now it was becoming something far more insidious, a game of truth itself, where the very act of asking the right questions could prove fatal. Act 3. The Price of Ambition. Chapter 5. The Dornish Gambit. The road north from Stonehenge wound through countryside that seemed to mock the turmoil consuming the realm. Spring flowers bloomed in roadside meadows, farmers worked their fields with the steady rhythm of centuries, and merchants' caravans moved along the king's roads as if the very foundations of the Seven Kingdoms weren't cracking beneath their feet. Sir Aldwyn Rivers rode in silence beside Lysa Snow, both of them acutely aware that every mile they traveled took them further from any hope of return. Behind them lay everything Aldwyn had ever known. His service to House Bracken, his modest but secure place in the world, the illusion that loyalty and honor were simple concepts with clear applications. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the slim hope that the documents in Lysa's saddlebags might prevent the realm from tearing itself apart. "You didn't have to come," Lysa said as they paused to water their horses at a stream that marked the border between Bracken and Tully lands. Lord Bracken's treason was exposed, his conspiracy broken. "You could have accepted Sir Bryndon's offer of clemency." Aldwyn loosened his horse's girth and let the animal drink, considering his answer. The truth was more complicated than duty or honor. It was the realization that his entire life had been built on foundations of sand, that the lords he had served and the causes he had fought for were less noble than he had allowed himself to believe. "A bastard learns early that the world doesn't owe him anything," he said finally. "But I thought, if I served faithfully, if I proved my worth through deed rather than birth, I might earn my place. What I learned last night is that there are some games where honor is just another word for fool." Lysa adjusted her sword belt, the weapon looking natural at her hip despite her gender. "My father used to say that bastards see the world more clearly than true-born children. We're not blinded by the comfortable lies about inheritance and destiny." "Your father was Brandon Stark," Aldwin said. It wasn't a question. Her northern features and gray eyes made her parentage unmistakable to anyone who had seen the Stark look before. "He was," she confirmed, "though he never acknowledged me, never gave me his name. I was just another reminder of his youth, hidden away in King's Landing, where his wife wouldn't have to look at me." Her voice carried old pain, but also something harder. "But bastards hear things that legitimate children miss. We're invisible to most lords, which means we see and hear everything." They remounted and continued north, following routes that Aldwin knew from years of patrolling the Riverlands. But now familiar landmarks seemed charged with new significance. The burned remains of a village that had been raided by mountain clansmen spoke of a realm where law was breaking down. The unusual number of armed men on the road suggested that every lord was preparing for something. It was near midday when they encountered the Dornish. The party appeared without warning, emerging from a copse of trees that bordered the road like ghosts materializing from shadow. 20 spears, their bronze points gleaming in the sunlight, and at their head a woman whose presence commanded immediate attention. She was perhaps 30 years of age, with the olive skin and dark eyes of the Dornish, her black hair bound in a practical braid that spoke of someone accustomed to action rather than courtly display. Her armor was fine, but functional boiled leather reinforced with steel, designed for mobility rather than show. But it was her bearing that marked her as someone of importance, the kind of natural authority that couldn't be feigned or purchased. "Sir Aldwin Rivers," she said, her voice carrying the musical accent of Dorne, "and the famous bastard of Brandon Stark. You've led us quite a chase." Aldwin's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, but he didn't draw. 20 Dornish spears against 2 riders weren't odds that could be improved by steel alone, and something in the woman's manner suggested this wasn't necessarily a hostile encounter. "You have the advantage of me, my lady," he said carefully. She smiled, an expression that transformed her stern features into something almost beautiful. "I am Nymeria Sand, natural daughter of Prince Oberyn Martell. And before you ask, yes, we've been following you since you left Stonehenge." "Following us why?" Lysa asked, her own hand near her weapon. "Because the documents you carry concern my family very directly," Nymeria replied. "The letters mentioning Prince Doran's willingness to treat with Jon Arryn, those negotiations have been proceeding for some time. But recent events have made my uncle cautious about revealing Dorne's hand too early." She gestured, and her spearmen spread out in a loose circle around Aldwin and Lysa, not threatening, but making it clear that retreat wasn't an option. "The poisoned weapons from Qohor that your evidence revealed," Nymeria continued, "they weren't intended just for Robert Baratheon and his supporters. 3 of those blades were meant for Dornish lords, my uncle included. Someone wanted to ensure that if Dorne joined the rebellion, it would be led by more compliant voices." Aldwin felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The same conspiracy that corrupted Lord Bracken wanted to eliminate Dornish leadership. "Precisely. Which means that whoever is behind this understands that Dorne's entry into the war would be decisive. 20,000 Dornish spears, led by competent commanders, arriving when Robert's forces are committed against the royal army." Nymeria shrugged. "The war would be over in months rather than years." "But your uncle hesitates," Lysa observed. "My uncle is cautious," Nymeria corrected, Dorn Amiyi has bled enough for Targaryen madness. Prince Rhaegar's infatuation with Lyanna Stark is seen by many as just another example of dragons taking what they want without regard for consequences. But that doesn't mean we're eager to see the realm consumed by civil war. She dismounted and approached them, her movements fluid and confident. The documents you carry prove that this conflict is larger than most people understand. Foreign gold, assassins, weapons designed to eliminate specific targets. This isn't just a rebellion against a mad king. This is someone trying to reshape the Seven Kingdoms to their advantage. Aldwin dismounted as well, recognizing that this conversation required the courtesy of meeting on equal ground. "What does Prince Doran want?" "Proof," Nymeria said simply. "Not just of Lord Bracken's conspiracy, but of the larger network behind it. Names, connections, evidence that can be presented to lords who are still deciding which side to support." She paused, studying Lysa with particular intensity. "And he wants to know what else Brandon Stark's daughter learned during her time in King's Landing." Lysa's jaw tightened. "I learned that the Mad King isn't just mad. He's being manipulated. Someone has been feeding him information about Wildfire, encouraging his paranoia, pushing him toward decisions that will justify rebellion while ensuring that rebellion succeeds." "Someone in the Citadel," Aldwin added, remembering Maester Donnell's warnings. "Someone with access to the highest levels of government," Nymeria agreed. "Which brings us to why we're here, rather than simply letting you continue to Jon Arryn." She reached into her saddlebags and withdrew a scroll bearing Prince Doran's seal. "My uncle proposes an alternative. Instead of riding north to the Vale, come south to Dorne. Help us identify the true architects of this conspiracy. And in return," she let the pause stretch, clearly enjoying the dramatic moment. "In return, Dorne will not merely join the rebellion. We will lead it. Prince Doran will declare for Robert Baratheon, call his banners, and march north with the full strength of Dorne behind him. But more than that, he will use Dorne's connections throughout the free cities to cut off the foreign gold that's funding the royalist cause." The offer was staggering in its implications. Dorne's military might was formidable, but their diplomatic and commercial networks were equally valuable. If Prince Doran could disrupt the financial backing that was keeping certain lords loyal to the crown— "And if we refuse?" Aldwin asked. Nymeria's smile turned sharp. "Then you continue north, carry your messages to Jon Arryn, and hope that the Vale's strength will be sufficient when the royal army marches. But consider this. How many of the lords Arryn is counting on for support might have been compromised by the same forces that corrupted Bracken? How many of his advisors might not be what they seem?" The question struck home with uncomfortable force. If faceless men had infiltrated the Citadel, if foreign gold was flowing to loyalist lords throughout the realm, then the rebellion's chances were far more precarious than anyone realized. Lysa looked at Aldwin, clearly torn between her original mission and this new possibility. "How do we know we can trust you? How do we know this isn't just another trap?" "You don't," Nymeria admitted. "But consider the alternatives. Continue north and hope that Jon Arryn's network is clean, knowing that enemies you can't identify are working against you. Or come south and help us root out the conspiracy at its source, with the full backing of a great house that has every reason to see it destroyed." She remounted her horse with fluid grace. "I won't press you for an immediate answer. My spearmen and I will camp tonight at the crossroads ahead. If you wish to accept Prince Doran's offer, join us there. If not," she shrugged, "ride north with our blessing and hope that honor and good intentions it will be enough." The Dornish departed as suddenly as they had appeared, their bronze spear points glinting in the afternoon sun as they disappeared around a bend in the road. Aldwin and Lysa were left alone with their horses and a decision that could reshape the course of the war. "What do you think?" Lysa asked. Aldwin studied the road ahead, the northern route that would take them to Jon Arryn and the Vale, where duty and honor demanded they go. Then he looked at the southern fork, leading toward Dorne, and possibilities that were as dangerous as they were promising. I think, he said slowly, that bastards and outcasts might be exactly what this fight needs. The legitimate heirs and rightful lords have made a mess of things. Perhaps it's time for those who were never supposed to matter to take a hand. As they rode toward the crossroads where their choice would be made, neither of them noticed the ravens circling overhead dark shapes against the blue sky, carrying messages between players in a game that was growing more complex with each passing day. Chapter 6. The Iron Serpents. The crossroads where Nymeria Sand had promised to wait was marked by an ancient stone waymarker, its carved directions worn smooth by centuries of weather. 3 roads met there, north to the Vale, south to Dorne, and east toward King's Landing, making it a natural gathering place for travelers and, as events would prove, for those who hunted them. Aldwin and Lysa arrived as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Aldwin uncomfortably of the Targaryen colors. The Dornish camp was exactly where Nymeria had indicated, a cluster of simple tents arranged in a defensive pattern that spoke of military discipline. But they were not alone at the crossroads. A second camp had been established on the eastern approach, and the banners flying above it made Aldwin's blood run cold. Black cloth emblazoned with a silver serpent coiled around a spear, the device of the Iron Serpents, a sellsword company with a reputation for taking contracts that other mercenaries would refuse. "Friends of yours?" Lysa asked, her hand moving to her sword hilt as she counted the armed figures moving between the tents. "The opposite," Aldwin replied grimly. "The Iron Serpents specialize in what they call problem-solving. If they're here, it means someone wants us to disappear permanently." As if summoned by their conversation, a figure emerged from the Dornish camp and approached them. Nymeria Sand moved with the same fluid confidence she had displayed earlier, but now there was tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. "You came," she said, though her eyes were fixed on the Iron Serpent's camp. "I wasn't certain you would, given our unexpected company." "How unexpected?" Aldwin asked. "They arrived 2 hours ago," Nymeria replied. 40 men, well-armed and disciplined. Their captain is a Tyroshi named Corro the Red, and he's made it clear that he has business with travelers matching your description. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. 40 Iron Serpents against 20 Dornish spears and 2 exhausted fugitives weren't favorable odds under any circumstances. Worse, the crossroads location meant there was nowhere to run that wouldn't expose them to attack from multiple directions. "What does he want?" Lysa asked. "To complete a contract," said a new voice from behind them. They turned to see a man approaching from the Iron Serpent's camp, tall and lean, with the red-dyed beard that marked him as Tyroshi, and scars that spoke of a lifetime spent with weapons. His armor was expensive but practical, and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his commands obeyed. "Captain Corro," Nymeria said, her voice carefully neutral. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Nymeria Sand," Corro replied with a slight bow that managed to be both courteous and mocking. "The Red Viper's bastard. Your reputation precedes you, though I confess I'm surprised to find you so far from Dorne's borders." "Business takes me where it will," she replied, "as it apparently does you." Corro's smile revealed teeth stained red from the wine of his homeland. "Indeed, and my current business involves the 2 travelers you've been so kindly escorting." His pale eyes fixed on Aldwin and Lysa. "A bastard knight with more honor than sense, and a northern girl with documents that certain parties would prefer to remain private." "The documents are already public," Lysa said. "Lord Bracken's conspiracy has been exposed, his allies arrested or fled. "Oh, my dear girl," Coro laughed, the sound like metal scraping stone. "Lord Bracken was a small fish in a very large pond. The people who hired me are concerned with much larger game." He gestured, and more iron serpents emerged from their camp. Not just the soldiers Aldwin had counted before, but specialists. He could see crossbowmen taking positions among the trees, scouts melting into the tall grass that bordered the road, and what looked like an alchemist setting up some kind of apparatus near their largest tent. "You see," Coro continued conversationally, "certain parties in Lys have invested heavily in the current political situation. They've purchased loyalties, funded operations, and arranged for specific outcomes. Your interference threatens to upset calculations that have been years in the making." "Lysini slavers," Nymeria spat. "I should have known." "Not slavers," Coro corrected. "Magisters. Men of vision who understand that chaos creates opportunity, and that the Seven Kingdoms' instability represents the greatest opportunity the free cities have seen in centuries." The pieces were falling into place in Aldwin's mind. They want Westeros weakened by civil war, divided, impoverished, desperate for foreign gold and foreign goods. Exactly. Coro's smile widened. A strong, unified Westeros is a threat to free city interests, but a Westeros fractured by rebellion, drained by years of warfare, suspicious of its own lords and institutions. That's a market to be exploited. "And the Mad King's wildfire obsession?" Lysa asked. "Carefully cultivated. Nothing destabilizes a realm quite like the threat of a monarch who might burn his own capital to spite his enemies." Coro's expression grew more serious. "But your little adventure at Stonehenge has disrupted that plan. Too many connections exposed, too many patterns revealed. My employers have decided that a more direct approach is required." Nymeria's spearmen had formed a defensive line without any visible signal, their bronze points gleaming in the fading light. But the iron serpents had responded by revealing just how thoroughly they had prepared for this encounter. Crossbow bolts could reach the Dornish position from multiple angles, and Aldwin could see that the alchemist's apparatus was some kind of fire projector, a weapon that could turn the crossroads into an inferno. "You're outnumbered and outpositioned," Coro observed. "Surrender the girl and her documents, and the rest of you can walk away. Continue this foolishness, and you'll all feed the crows." It was then that Lysa surprised everyone by laughing, a sound with genuine amusement in it. "You talk about plans and calculations," she said, "but you've made the same mistake that every southern lord makes when dealing with the north. You assume we're alone." She put 2 fingers to her lips and produced a whistle that cut through the evening air like a blade. The sound was answered immediately by another whistle from the north, then another from the west, and finally a third from the south. "What?" Coro began, then stopped as figures began emerging from concealment all around the crossroads. They came from the tall grass, from behind trees, from depressions in the ground that Aldwin would have sworn were empty moments before. Men in brown and green, moving with the silent efficiency of those who had spent their lives hunting in deep forests. Each carried a longbow, and each had an arrow nocked and ready. "Northern hunters," Lysa explained casually. "Men who served my father in life and swore to protect his blood after death. Did you really think I would travel the roads alone, carrying documents this important, without some form of escort?" The standoff had shifted dramatically. The iron serpents still held superior numbers and position, but the longbows surrounding them could thin their ranks significantly before any charge could reach the Dornish line. More importantly, the hunters' presence meant that escape routes the sellswords had been counting on were now blocked. Coro's face had gone pale beneath his red beard. "This changes nothing. We still have contracts to fulfill." "Then fulfill them," Nymeria said, drawing her own blade. "But understand that fulfilling them will cost you everything you have." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. 40 iron serpents, 20 Dornish spears, and perhaps 30 northern hunters, all professionals, all prepared to die for their causes. The crossroads that had seen countless peaceful meetings was about to become a battlefield that would be remembered in songs, assuming anyone survived to sing them. It was Captain Yorick of the Golden Company who broke the deadlock. The sellsword captain emerged from the eastern road leading a column of his own men, not the full strength of the Golden Company, but enough to tip the balance decisively. His presence transformed what had been a complex but manageable conflict into something approaching a small war. "Captain Coro," Yorick called out as his men deployed with professional efficiency. "Still taking contracts from Lysani Magisters, I see." "Yorick!" Coro replied, his voice tight with strain. "I thought you were bound for King's Landing." "Plans change," Yorick said simply, "especially when one learns that old enemies are operating in the same theater." He looked around the crossroads, taking in the various forces arrayed against each other. "Quite a gathering we have here. Northern hunters, Dornish spears, sellswords of various allegiances, and at the center of it all, 2 fugitives carrying papers that apparently half the free cities want to see destroyed." "This doesn't concern you," Coro warned. "Doesn't it?" Yorick's smile was cold as winter steel. "The Golden Company has taken its share of Lysani gold over the years, but we've also learned not to trust employers who use poison and assassination instead of honest battle. The Magisters who hired you burned one of my lieutenants alive when he refused to murder prisoners. That makes this very much my concern." The revelation that the Golden Company was operating under its own agenda added yet another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Aldwin found himself wondering if anyone present was exactly what they claimed to be, or if the entire encounter was some elaborate dance choreographed by powers that remained hidden. "Enough," Nymeria said, her voice cutting through the growing tension. "We could stand here trading threats until the sun rises, but that serves no one's interests except the Ravens." She raised her voice so it carried to all the armed groups surrounding the crossroads. "I propose a different solution. Single combat. Champions from each side, fighting until yield or death. Winner takes all." The proposal was so unexpected that for a moment no one spoke. Then Coro began to laugh, the sound harsh in the evening air. "Single combat? This isn't some tourney, girl. This is business." "Exactly," Nymeria replied. "And good business requires efficient solutions. You want the documents and the girl. We want safe passage and the right to complete our mission. Single combat determines the outcome with minimal loss of life and maximum honor for all parties." "Honor," Coro spat. "The Golden Company speaks of honor. The Dornish speak of honor. Even the Northern bastards speak of honor. But honor doesn't pay wages or fulfill contracts." "No," Aldwin said, stepping forward. "But it does separate men from animals. And right now, Captain, you're sounding more like an animal with each word you speak." The insult hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Coro's hand moved to his sword hilt, his scarred face flushing with anger that made his red beard seem pale by comparison. "You dare!" "I dare," Aldwin ciphered it as immediately. "And I'll prove it with steel, if you have the courage to face me." The challenge was issued, and there was no taking it back. Around the crossroads, men who had been preparing for a chaotic melee began to see the possibility of something cleaner, more decisive. Single combat was a tradition honored by soldiers throughout the known world, and even the most hardened sellsword could appreciate its elegance. "Champion combat," Yorick mused. "I like it. Clean, simple, final." "The Iron Serpents don't need champions," Coro snarled. "We have superior numbers and position." "You have numbers," one of the northern hunters called out, his bow still trained on the sellsword camp. "Position is another matter entirely." The truth of that statement was becoming increasingly clear. The hunters' longbows commanded every approach to the crossroads, while the Golden Company's arrival had blocked the eastern escape route. The Iron Serpents might win a general engagement, but they would pay a price that would leave them vulnerable to other enemies. "One combat," Nymeria pressed. "Oh, your champion against ours. If you win, we yield the documents and withdraw. If we win, you abandon your contract and withdraw. Clean, simple, honorable." Koro looked around at the forces arrayed against him, calculating odds and costs with the cold precision of a professional soldier. Finally, he nodded. "One combat," he agreed. "But I choose my own champion, and the fight is to the death. No yielding, no mercy." "Agreed," Aldwin said before anyone else could speak. "When do we begin?" As the sun touched the western horizon, painting the crossroads in shades of blood and gold, the stage was set for a combat that would determine the fate of secrets that could reshape the Seven Kingdoms. And in the gathering darkness, ravens circled overhead, waiting to carry news of victory or defeat to powers that moved in shadow. The Game of Thrones was about to claim new pieces. Chapter 7. Steel and Shadows. The circle formed naturally, as such circles always do when warriors gather to witness single combat. Iron Serpents, Dornish spears, Northern hunters, and Golden Company veterans created a ring of steel and watching eyes, their previous enmities temporarily set aside in favor of the ancient ritual about to unfold. Torches had been lit as the last light faded from the western sky, casting dancing shadows that made the crossroads seem like some ancient amphitheater built for the entertainment of gods. In the center of the circle, two men prepared to settle with blade what armies might have decided with blood. Aldwin Rivers checked his armor one final time, boiled leather reinforced with steel plates, practical protection that had served him well through 15 years of service to House Bracken. His sword was equally practical, a bastard blade with a plain crossguard and leather-wrapped grip worn smooth by countless hours of training and use. Nothing fancy, nothing that would catch the eye at a tournament, but steel that had never failed him when his life depended on it. Across from him, Koro the Red made his own preparations with the ritual care of a man who had survived dozens of such combats. The Tyroshi captain had shed his traveling clothes in favor of scale mail that gleamed like silver in the torchlight, and his weapon was a curved sword of Valyrian steel, not one of the great ancestral blades, but fine enough to cut through lesser metal like parchment. "Nervous bastard?" Koro called out, his voice carrying easily across the circle. "Should I be?" Aldwin replied, testing his grip on his sword hilt. "Most men are, when they're about to die for a cause they don't understand." Aldwin smiled, and something in that expression made several of the watching sellswords shift uncomfortably. "I understand the cause well enough. The question is whether you do." Before Koro could respond, Nymeria Sand stepped into the circle, her role as marshal of the combat, giving her temporary authority over men who would normally treat her as an enemy. "The terms are agreed," she announced, her voice carrying to every watching warrior. "Single combat, to the death, no quarter asked or given. The victor's side claims the right to depart unmolested, with whatever they came to protect." She looked at both combatants. "Do you both accept these terms?" "I do," Aldwin said. "As do I," Koro agreed, though his eyes never left his opponent. "Then may the gods judge the right of it," Nymeria said, stepping back to the edge of the circle. "Begin." They circled each other slowly at first, each taking the measure of his opponent. Koro moved with the fluid grace of water, his curved blade weaving patterns in the air that spoke of training in the fighting pits of the free cities. Aldwin's movements were more economical, the efficient motions of a man taught to conserve energy for the moments when it mattered most. The first exchange came without warning. Koro lunged forward, his Valyrian steel singing through the air in a cut aimed at Aldwin's neck. The bastard knight's blade rose to meet it, and the clash of steel rang across the crossroads like a bell tolling. They separated, circled, engaged again. This time it was Aldwin who pressed the attack, his bastard sword seeking gaps in Koro's defense with methodical precision. The Tyroshi gave ground, his curved blade turning aside each thrust with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed. "You fight well for a Westerosi," Koro admitted as they paused to catch their breath. "But technique alone won't save you." "No," Aldwin agreed. "But technique combined with a righteous cause might." They closed again, and this time the combat began in earnest. Koro's blade wove a web of silver death, each cut flowing into the next with lethal beauty. But Aldwin had fought Dothraki screamers and iron-born reavers, men whose lives depended on speed and aggression, and he had learned to find the gaps in even the most fluid attacks. His counterattack came when Koro overextended slightly on a particularly ambitious cut. Aldwin's pommel strike caught the Tyroshi in the ribs, cracking scale mail and driving the breath from his lungs. Koro staggered back, his perfect form disrupted for just a moment, but a moment was all Aldwin needed. The bastard sword swept up in an arc that should have opened Koro from hip to shoulder, but the sellsword captain was faster than he had appeared. He threw himself backward, the blade missing him by inches, and rolled to his feet with cat-like grace. "First blood to you," he acknowledged, touching his ribs where the pommel strike had landed. "But first blood doesn't win combats." "No," Aldwin said, settling back into his guard position. "Death does." What followed was less a duel than a deadly dance, two masters of their craft testing each other's limits with steel and fire. Koro's Valyrian blade could cut through Aldwin's lesser weapon, but only if it could find the edge, and the bastard knight was too experienced to present such opportunities carelessly. The watching crowd had fallen silent, transfixed by the deadly artistry unfolding before them. Even the Iron Serpents, who had come expecting an easy victory, found themselves grudgingly appreciating their opponent's skill. It was Lysa Snow who noticed the wrongness first. "Something's not right," she whispered to Nymeria, her eyes not on the combatants, but on the darkness beyond the torchlight. Too quiet, no night sounds. Nymeria's attention snapped away from the duel, her warrior's instincts suddenly alert. Lysa was right. The normal sounds of evening had faded away, leaving only the ring of steel and the harsh breathing of the fighters. "Ambush," she breathed, her hand moving to her weapon. The attack came from all sides at once. They poured out of the darkness like a tide of shadow, and steel men in dark armor, with faces hidden behind masks, moving with the coordinated precision of elite soldiers. Not sellswords or common bandits, but something far more dangerous. "Faceless men!" Yorick shouted, his voice cutting through the confusion as his Golden Company veterans formed a defensive line. "All of you, form up! This isn't about the documents anymore!" The neat circle of combat dissolved into chaos, as warriors who had been prepared to watch a duel suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives. The attackers had planned well. They struck just as everyone's attention was focused on the single combat, when guards were relaxed and formations loose. But they had underestimated their opponents. The northern hunters melted into the darkness with the silent efficiency of men who had spent their lives in deep forests, their longbows singing death into the ranks of the attackers. The Dornish spears formed a bristling wall of bronze points, their discipline holding even in the face of surprise. And the Golden Company, veterans of 100 battles, rallied with the speed of true professionals. In the center of the chaos, Aldwin and Koro found themselves back to back, their personal combat forgotten in the face of a greater threat. "Looks like someone decided not to wait for the outcome of our duel," Koro observed, his curved blade flickering out to open the throat of a masked attacker. "Any idea who they are?" Aldwin asked, his bastard sword taking an enemy in the chest. "Faceless men don't work alone," Koro replied. "Someone with serious resources wanted to make sure none of us left here alive." The battle raged around them with savage intensity. The attackers were skilled and well-equipped, but they had lost the advantage of surprise and found themselves facing opponents who were anything but helpless. Worse for them, the various factions that had been prepared to fight each other were now united against a common enemy. Nymeria Sand danced through the combat with deadly grace, her spear weaving patterns of destruction that would have impressed her legendary namesake. Beside her, Lysa Snow fought with the grim determination of someone who had already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to fear. "The documents!" Lysa shouted over the din of battle. "They're after the documents!" She was right. Several of the attackers were moving toward the Dornish camp, where their saddlebags had been secured, ignoring easier targets in their determination to reach their true objective. "Not if I can help it," Yorick growled, leading a charge of Golden Company veterans that cut through the attackers like a sword through silk. The battle's tide turned when the northern hunters began their deadly work in earnest. Longbow shafts whistled out of the darkness with mechanical regularity, each one finding its mark with the precision that came from a lifetime of hunting in the deep woods. The attackers, caught in the open ground of the crossroads, began falling with increasing frequency. But it was Aldwyn who ended it. The bastard knight had noticed what others missed. One of the attackers moved differently from the rest, with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command. When that figure raised a horn to his lips, clearly intending to summon reinforcements, Aldwyn acted without thought. His throw was perfect, the bastard sword spinning end over end through the torchlit air to take the horn-bearer in the chest. The man fell without a sound, the horn clattering away into the darkness, and with his death, the coordination went out of the attack. The remaining attackers broke and fled, melting back into the darkness as suddenly as they had appeared. In the space of perhaps 10 minutes, the crossroads had been transformed from a place of ritual combat into a battlefield strewn with the dead and dying. "Well," Corro said, breathing hard as he surveyed the carnage, "that was unexpected." "Was it?" Nymeria asked, wiping blood from her spear point. "We've been assuming this conspiracy involves Lyseni Magisters and corrupted lords. But what if it goes deeper? What if someone has been playing all sides against each other from the beginning?" Lysa knelt beside one of the fallen attackers, pulling away the mask to reveal features that could have belonged to anyone or no one. "Faceless men," she confirmed. But working for whom? It was Yorick who provided the answer, his weathered face grim as he examined something he had taken from the horn-bearer's body. "This seal," he said, holding up a small medallion. "I've seen it before, in Volantis. It belongs to the Triarchs, the ruling council of the city." The implications hit them all at once. Not Lyseni Magisters acting independently, but the full resources of one of the most powerful free cities, working to destabilize Westeros for their own ends. "They want the Seven Kingdoms weak and divided," Aldwyn said, understanding flooding through him. "A fractured realm is easier to exploit than a unified one. And they've been playing every side," Nymeria added, "funding the loyalists through corrupted lords, supporting the rebels through foreign agents, ensuring that no matter who wins Westeros will be too damaged to resist their influence." "The question is," Lysa said, "what do we do about it?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Captain Corro, who had begun the evening as their enemy, now stepped forward with something like respect in his scarred features. "The Iron Serpents withdraw our contract," he announced. "What we've learned here tonight, this isn't the kind of game we want to play." He looked at Aldwyn with something approaching approval. "Your duel is forfeit, bastard. Not because either of us yielded, but because greater enemies have made our quarrel meaningless." "Agreed," Aldwyn said, retrieving his sword from where it had found its mark. "The real fight is bigger than any of us realized." As dawn broke over the crossroads, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, the survivors of the night's violence made their plans. The documents Lysa carried were more important than ever, but their destination had changed. "Not north to John Arryn," Nymeria said as they broke their fast around a campfire built from the wreckage of battle. "South to Dorne, as we originally planned. Prince Doran needs to know that this conspiracy reaches all the way to Volantis." "And from Dorne?" Lysa asked. "From Dorne, we take the fight to them," Aldwyn said, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even him. "If the Free Cities want to play the Game of Thrones, then we'll teach them that the game has rules they never learned." The bastard knight had found his cause at last, not service to a lord or loyalty to a king, but the defense of a realm that, for all its flaws, was his home. And as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, he felt something he had never experienced before. The certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Chapter 8. The Price of Truth. 3 days south of the crossroads, the landscape began to change from the green hills of the Riverlands to the red stone and sparse vegetation that marked the approach to Dorne. The air grew warmer, the nights shorter, and the horizon shimmered with heat that spoke of desert lands beyond. Aldwyn rode beside Lysa Snow at the head of their unlikely Column 20 Dornish spears, a dozen Golden Company veterans who had chosen to accompany Jorek on his new mission, and 3 northern hunters who served as scouts and guides. Behind them, carefully protected in the center of their formation, rode the most important member of their party, a man who had appeared at their camp the morning after the battle, bearing news that changed everything. Maester Donnell looked older than his years, his gray robes dusty from hard travel and his face drawn with exhaustion. But his eyes burned with the intensity of a man who had discovered truths too terrible to ignore. "Tell me again about the ravens," Aldwyn said, as they paused to rest their horses beside a stream that marked the boundary between the Reach and Dorne. Donnell dismounted stiffly, his joints protesting the unaccustomed rigors of life on the road. 17 Maesters, he said, his voice hoarse from days of explanation and argument. 17 men I had known for decades, whose letters suddenly began carrying subtle differences, changes in handwriting that could be explained by age or injury, references to events that never happened, or memories that belonged to someone else. He pulled a leather satchel from his saddlebags, the same kind that Lysa carried, but bulkier, weighted down with correspondence from across the 7 kingdoms. Qyburn's potion worked exactly as he promised, Donald continued. 3 drops in wine, and any faceless man wearing another's face begins to deteriorate. The disguise fails, the borrowed memories become confused, and the truth reveals itself. "How many did you test?" Nymeria asked, her voice carefully neutral. 7, Donald. El replied, 7 Maesters in whom I detected inconsistencies, and all 7, he shuddered, remembering. All 7 were not who they claimed to be. The Citadel has been compromised more thoroughly than anyone imagined. Lysa studied the surrounding countryside with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust appearances. If they can replace Maesters, they can replace anyone. Lords, knights, servants, how do we know that anyone is who they claim to be? It was a question that had been haunting all of them since Donnell's arrival. The revelation that the conspiracy reached into the very heart of Westeros's scholarly institutions had shaken assumptions that had seemed as solid as stone. "We test everyone," Jorek said pragmatically. "Qyburn gave us enough of his compound to verify the identity of key figures. It's not pleasant, but it's necessary." "And if we find more imposters?" Aldwyn asked. "Then we deal with them," Nymeria replied, her hand resting on her spear. "Permanently." They remounted and continued south, the red stones of Dorne rising around them like the bones of some ancient giant. The landscape was harsh but beautiful, painted in shades of crimson and gold that seemed to glow with inner fire. It was a land that bred hard people warriors who could find water in the desert and turn sand into fortress walls. As they rode, Donald continued his grim recitation of discoveries. The Citadel's neutrality had been purchased with Volantine gold, channeled through banking houses in Old Town that specialized in discretion. Key positions had been filled with men whose loyalty lay not with knowledge or the realm, but with foreign masters who viewed Westeros as a market to be exploited. The worst part, he said, is how long it's been going on. Years, perhaps decades. The faceless men have been patient, building their network one replacement at a time, waiting for the right moment to activate their assets. And Robert's rebellion was that moment, Lysa observed. The perfect catalyst, Donald agreed. A realm tearing itself apart. Lords choosing sides based on incomplete information. Battles fought for causes that may have been manufactured by their enemies. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they crested a ridge and saw their destination spread out below them. Sunspear, the seat of House Martell, its towers and walls rising from the desert like a mirage made solid. But something was wrong. The city's gates were closed, unusual for the time of day when merchants and travelers would normally be seeking entry. Smoke rose from several points within the walls, and they could see figures moving on the battlements with the urgency of defenders preparing for siege. "Trouble," Nymeria said, her voice tight with concern for her homeland. They spurred their horses down the ridge, covering the remaining distance to Sunspear's gates at a gallop that raised clouds of red dust behind them. As they approached, guards appeared on the walls, Dornish spears in their hands, but their faces were grim with worry rather than welcome. "Open the gates!" Nymeria called out, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "I am Nymeria Sand, daughter of Prince Oberyn, returning with urgent news for Prince Doran." The response came not from the guards, but from a figure who appeared on the wall above the gate. A woman in the robes of a septa, her face hidden by a hood, but her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Lady Nymeria," the woman called down, "Prince Doran is indisposed. Perhaps you should seek accommodation elsewhere until matters within the city are resolved." The careful phrasing sent chills through the watching group. Aldwyn's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, while Yorick began scanning the walls for signs of how many defenders the city actually held. "What's happened?" Nymeria demanded. "There was an incident," the Septa replied. "Several members of the Prince's Council became ill after the evening meal 3 days ago. The Prince himself has been affected, though his condition is not life-threatening." Poison. The word hung unspoken in the air between them, but everyone understood the implication. Someone had moved against House Martell's leadership at the worst possible moment. "Open the gates," Nymeria repeated, her voice carrying new steel. "I am Prince Oberyn's daughter, and I demand entry to my family's seat." "I'm afraid that's not possible," the Septa said. "The city is under quarantine until the source of the illness can be determined." Lysa leaned close to Aldwyn, her voice barely a whisper. "That's not a Septa. Look at how she stands, how she moves. That's a warrior trying to play a role." Aldwyn studied the figure on the wall more carefully and realized Lysa was right. The woman's posture was too alert, too balanced for someone whose life had been spent in prayer and contemplation. Worse, her hands were positioned as if ready to draw weapons hidden beneath her robes. "We need to get inside," he said quietly. "The Watergate," Nymeria replied, equally quiet. "There's an entrance used by fishing boats on the city's eastern side. If it's not heavily guarded..." They began to withdraw, ostensibly accepting the refusal, but actually maneuvering to circle around to the alternative entrance. As they rode, Donnell pulled out one of his vials, not Qyburn's compound, but something else from his collection. "If Prince Doran has been poisoned," he said, "I may be able to help, but we need to reach him quickly. Some toxins work slowly at first, then accelerate." The Watergate proved to be lightly defended. 2 guards who were easily overwhelmed by Jorik's veterans. They found themselves in the lower levels of Sunspear, moving through passages that reeked of fish and salt water. "This way," Nymeria whispered, leading them through corridors she had known since childhood. "The prince's chambers are in the Tower of the Sun." They climbed through the ancient keep, their footsteps echoing softly in passages built from the red stone that gave Dorne its character. But as they ascended, the wrongness of the situation became more apparent. Too few servants, too many closed doors, and an atmosphere of fear that seemed to permeate the very walls. It was in the corridor outside Prince Doran's chambers that they found the first body. The man lay sprawled beside an overturned table, his face twisted in the rictus of a painful death. His clothes marked him as a servant, but the dagger in his hand suggested he had died fighting. "Poison," Donald confirmed after a brief examination, but not the same type that affected the prince. This was something faster, more violent. A different poison for different purposes, Aldwin realized. Kill the servants who might resist. Disable the lords who need to be kept alive for questioning. They found Prince Doran in his solar, slumped in his chair, but still breathing. The Prince of Dorne looked older than his years, his face pale and drawn with pain, but his dark eyes still held intelligence. "Nymeria," he whispered as they entered, "you shouldn't have come. It's not safe." "Nowhere is safe anymore, Uncle," she replied, kneeling beside his chair. "The conspiracy we warned you about, it's here, in Sunspear itself." Donnell was already examining the prince, checking his pulse and studying his symptoms with professional efficiency. "Tears of Lys," he diagnosed, "slow-acting, designed to weaken rather than kill immediately. You have perhaps a day before the effects become irreversible." "Can you treat it?" Nymeria asked. "Yes, but not here. The antidote requires preparation, and we need somewhere secure to work." Donnell looked around the solar with its rich hangings and expensive furniture. "This place is compromised. Anyone could be watching, listening, waiting for the right moment to strike again." It was then that they heard the sound boots in the corridor outside, moving with the disciplined cadence of soldiers. Too many boots, and coming from multiple directions. "We're surrounded," Yorick observed, moving to the window to assess their options. "The false septa?" Aldwin asked. "Among others," Yorick confirmed. "I count at least 20 men in the courtyard below, all armed and moving to block the exits." Prince Doran struggled to sit upright in his chair, the effort clearly costing him. "There's another way," he whispered. "Secret passages built into the tower's walls. But you'll have to leave me behind." "No," Nymeria said firmly. "We came here to warn you about the conspiracy. We're not leaving without you." "The realm needs you alive more than it needs me," Doran replied. "Take the documents, expose the truth, rally the lords who can still be trusted." It was Lysa who provided the solution, her bastard's pragmatism cutting through the noble sentiment. "We take the prince," she said, "but not the way they expect. Donald, how quickly can you prepare a dose of your antidote?" 10 minutes, perhaps 15 if I have the right materials." "Do it, Yorick. Can your men hold the corridor for that long?" The sellsword captain grinned, the expression wolfish in the lamplight. "Against 20 men? It'll be close, but yes." "Then here's what we do," Lysa continued, her mind racing ahead to possibilities that others hadn't seen. "We make them think we're trying to escape through the secret passages, while actually using those passages to get the prince to a safer location within the city." "Where?" Nymeria asked. "The Sept of Remembrance," Lysa replied. "If I remember correctly from the conversations at Stonehenge, it's the one place in Sunspear that even the conspirators wouldn't dare attack openly. Too much symbolic importance, too many witnesses. It was a desperate plan, but it had the virtue of simplicity." While Yorick's men held the corridor and Donald prepared his medicines, Aldwin and the others would evacuate Prince Doran through passages that his enemies knew existed but couldn't easily follow. The sound of steel meeting steel echoed through the Tower of the Sun as battle was joined outside the solar. Yorick's veterans were outnumbered but not outclassed, and they sold every inch of ground dearly. "Ready?" Don Uthal announced, holding up a vial of clear liquid. "This should counteract the poison, but the prince will need rest and care." They lifted Prince Doran between them, Aldwin taking most of his weight, while Nymeria guided them to a section of wall that looked identical to every other section. Her fingers found hidden catches, and suddenly they were looking at a narrow passage that led down into the depths of the tower. "Go!" Yorick called from the doorway, where his blade was holding back 3 attackers at once. "We'll follow when we can." The passage was narrow and steep, carved from the living rock centuries ago by builders who understood that even the strongest fortress needed hidden ways. They descended in single file, the sound of battle fading above them as they went deeper into Sunspear's foundations. When they finally emerged, it was into a storage cellar beneath a baker's shop, the air thick with the smell of flour and yeast. Through the cellar's small windows, they could see the Sept of Remembrance rising across the square sanctuary, if they could reach it. "The prince is getting heavier," Aldwin observed, adjusting his grip. "The antidote is working," Donnell said. "His body is purging the poison, but the process is exhausting." They made their way across the square in the pre-dawn darkness, 3 figures supporting a 4th, looking for all the world, like friends helping a companion who had drunk too much wine. The Sept's doors were open for morning prayers, and they slipped inside just as the sun's first rays began painting the eastern sky. Inside the Sept of Remembrance, surrounded by the carved images of the 7 and the smell of incense, they finally had a moment to catch their breath and assess their situation. "The conspiracy has moved faster than we anticipated," Prince Doran said, his voice stronger now that Donnell's antidote was taking effect. "Someone knew we were coming, knew what documents you carried, and prepared accordingly." "The question is who?" Nymeria said. "The false Septa, certainly, but she was taking orders from someone else. Someone with access to information that should have been secret," Lysa added. "Someone who knew about our plans before we made them." The implications were troubling. If their enemies could anticipate their moves so precisely, it suggested a level of infiltration that went beyond replacing a few meisters or corrupting a handful of lords. "We need to assume that everything we've planned is known," Aldwin said. "Every ally we were counting on, every strategy we discussed, all of it compromised." "Then what do we do?" Nymeria asked. Prince Doran struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his niece for support, but standing straight. "We do what Dorn has always done when faced with overwhelming enemies," he said. "We disappear into the desert, gather our strength, and strike back when they least expect it." "The documents," Lysa began, "are important, but not as important as staying alive to use them," Doran interrupted. "We'll find another way to expose the conspiracy, but first, we need to survive long enough to try." As the morning light streamed through the Sept's stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in patterns of red and gold, they began to plan their next move. The Game of Thrones had claimed more pieces, but the game itself was far from over. And somewhere in the city around them, enemies were already moving to close the trap they thought they had sprung. Chapter 9. The Dornish Gambit. The Sept of Remembrance had been their sanctuary for 3 days, but sanctuary could not last forever. As Prince Doran's strength returned under Maester Donald's care, the reality of their situation became increasingly clear. Sunspear was still in enemy hands, and with each passing hour, the false Septa would be consolidating her control over the city. "We need to retake the palace," Nymeria said on the morning of the 4th day, her voice carrying the steel that marked her as Prince Oberyn's daughter. "Every moment we delay gives our enemies time to eliminate potential allies and strengthen their position." Aldwin studied the layout Nymeria had sketched in the dirt, a rough map of Sunspear's defenses, marked with guard positions and patrol routes that she had observed from the Sept's bell tower. The false Septa had been thorough in her preparations, but thoroughness could become predictability with the right approach. "She's using the same defensive patterns that a real septa would employ," he observed. "Concentrated guards at obvious entrances, minimal patrols in areas considered secure by religious tradition." "Which means?" Prince Doran asked, his voice still weak, but his mind sharp as ever. "Which means she doesn't understand Dorn," Lysa replied, her bastard's insight cutting to the heart of the matter. "She's prepared for a conventional assault, but not for the kind of unconventional warfare that made your ancestors unconquerable." The plan they devised over the following hours was quintessentially Dornish indirect, deceptive, and designed to turn the enemy's strengths against them. It would require precise timing, considerable risk, and a willingness to use methods that would never be recorded in any official history. They began at sunset, when the changing of the guard would provide natural cover for movement. Yorick and his remaining Golden Company veterans created a distraction at Sunspear's main gate, their visible approach drawing the attention of the defenders, while the real assault came from an entirely different direction. Aldwyn and Nymeria entered through the Septi's ancient crypts, following passages that connected the holy ground to the palace's deepest foundations. The tunnels were narrow and treacherous, carved from living rock by builders who had understood that even the most sacred places might need escape routes. "The septa will be in the Prince's solar," Nymeria whispered, as they navigated the darkness beneath Sunspear. "It's the most defensible position in the palace, and it puts her at the center of all communications." They emerged into a storage chamber beneath the Tower of the Sun, the same tower where Prince Doran's poisoning had taken place. The irony was not lost on Aldwyn. They were literally rising from the depths to reclaim what had been taken from above. The first guards they encountered died without raising an alarm, their throats opened by blades that moved in the darkness like whispers of death. These were not Dornish guards corrupted by gold, but foreign soldiers, whose presence in Sunspear was proof enough of their treachery. "Valentine," Nymeria confirmed after examining their equipment. "Professional soldiers, not sellswords. Someone with serious resources equipped this operation." They climbed through the tower's ancient stones, moving with the patience of hunters who understood that speed meant less than silence. Each level brought new challenges, more guards, better positioned, increasingly alert, as word of Yorick's distraction reached the palace's defenders. It was on the third level that they encountered the first faceless man. He wore the face of Sir Demon Sand, one of Prince Doran's household knights, but something in his posture betrayed him. Aldwyn's blade took him in the chest before he could cry out, and as he died, the borrowed features began to shift and blur, revealing the blank visage of a killer trained in Braavos. "How many more?" Aldwyn asked, wiping his sword clean. "Unknown," Nymeria replied. "But we have to assume that anyone we encounter might not be who they appear to be." The climb continued, growing more perilous with each step. The false septa had prepared well, positioning her forces to control every approach to the prince's solar. But she had made one crucial error. She had assumed that her enemies would attack like Westerosi knights, with honor and directness, rather than like Dornish patriots, with cunning and ruthless efficiency. They reached the solar's antechamber as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of blood and gold. Through the heavy wooden door, they could hear voices, the false septa issuing orders to subordinates whose accents marked them as foreign. "The prince grows stronger," one voice reported in the musical tones of Lys. "Maester Donnell's antidote is more effective than anticipated." "Then we accelerate our timeline," the false septa replied, her disguised voice carrying authority that spoke of long practice in command. "Send word to our contacts in King's Landing. The Mad King's wildfire reserves are to be activated immediately." Aldwyn felt his blood chill. They had suspected that the conspiracy reached beyond Dorne, but to hear confirmation that it extended all the way to King Aerys himself. "The plan remains unchanged," the septa continued. Westeros tears itself apart in civil war, while we position ourselves to benefit from the chaos. Robert Baratheon may win his rebellion, but he'll rule over ruins. And Prince Doran? Asked another voice, this one carrying the harsh accent of Volantis. We'll have an unfortunate accident once we've extracted all useful information from him. A tragic victim of the realm's instability, mourned by all who valued Dorne's wisdom. Nymeria's face had gone pale with fury, but her hand remained steady on her spear. This was the moment that would determine not just Sunspear's fate, but potentially the course of Robert's rebellion itself. Aldwin tested the door's handle unlocked, which suggested confidence bordering on arrogance. He looked at Nymeria, received her nod, and kicked the door open with all the force he could muster. The Solar erupted into chaos as they burst through the doorway. The false septa spun toward them, her borrowed features twisting into something far more dangerous than any holy woman should possess. Around her stood 6 men in the armor of various free cities, their weapons already half-drawn as they reacted to the sudden intrusion. "Kill them!" the septa commanded, her disguise finally slipping as the stress of combat revealed her true nature. The fight that followed was brief but savage. Aldwin's bastard sword sang through the air, taking one Volantene through the neck, while Nymeria's spear punched through the chest of a Lyseni who had been reaching for a crossbow. The remaining enemies fell in quick succession, their superior numbers meaningless in the confined space where Dornish weapons found their marks with deadly precision. The false septa herself proved more challenging. As her borrowed face began to shift and blur, revealing the blank features of a faceless man beneath, she drew a curved dagger that gleamed with an oily sheen. "Poison," Nymeria warned, recognizing the weapon's preparation. The creature that had worn a septa's face moved with inhuman grace, the dagger weaving patterns in the air that spoke of training in the House of Black and White. But for all her skill, she faced opponents who had been shaped by their own deadly schools. Aldwin's feint drew her attack, the poisoned blade passing inches from his throat, while Nymeria's spear thrust took her through the heart. The faceless man died as she had lived, wearing a face that belonged to someone else, her true identity lost in the moment of death. "The documents," Nymeria said, moving to a desk where papers lay scattered across the surface. "Orders, communication codes, financial records." As they gathered the intelligence that would prove the conspiracy's scope, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tower. But these were not the disciplined boots of enemy soldiers. They were the lighter steps of Dornish guards, moving with the confidence of men reclaiming their own stronghold. Yorick appeared in the doorway, his Golden Company veterans behind him, their faces grim with the satisfaction of a job well done. "The palace is secure," he reported. "Most of the foreign soldiers are dead or fled. The few Dornish who were corrupted by gold have been taken for questioning." "And the city?" Aldwin asked. "Rising," Yorick replied with a wolf's smile. "Apparently, the people of Sunspear don't appreciate foreign occupation, even when it comes disguised as religious authority. The false septa's supporters are having a difficult evening." They made their way down from the Tower of the Sun as Prince Doran was carried up on a litter, his strength returning, but his dignity demanding that he reclaim his seat of power in proper fashion. The prince's solar was cleansed of all traces of enemy occupation, and by dawn, Sunspear was once again under Martell control. But the documents they had captured revealed a conspiracy far larger than anyone had imagined. "Look at this," Lysa said, holding up a letter bearing the seal of Grand Maester Pycelle. "Orders to increase the Mad King's access to Wildfire, along with suggestions about which lords might be most vulnerable to persuasion. And this," Nymeria added, displaying a financial ledger that recorded payments flowing from Volantis to destinations throughout Westeros. "They've been funding both sides of the rebellion, ensuring that no matter who wins, the realm will be too weak to resist their influence." Prince Doran studied the evidence with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent his life navigating dangerous political currents. "We have three choices," he said finally. "We can send this evidence to Robert Baratheon and let him deal with the implications. We can act on it ourselves and risk being seen as overreaching our authority. Or we can do both," Aldwin said, understanding dawning in his mind. "We send the evidence to Robert, but we also move independently to ensure that the conspiracy's most dangerous elements are neutralized before they can do more damage." It was a risky strategy that would require perfect coordination and considerable trust between allies who had only recently discovered each other. But as they planned through the remaining hours of darkness, it became clear that risk was preferable to allowing the conspiracy to continue. The message that left Sunspear the next morning was carried by Prince Doran's swiftest riders, bearing both his seal and the captured documents that proved the Mad King's madness was being carefully cultivated by foreign enemies. The letter that accompanied the evidence was carefully worded, offering Dorne's full military support for Robert's cause, while suggesting specific targets that might benefit from immediate attention. But the real response was already in motion. 2,000 Dornish spears began their march north within hours of the palace's recapture, moving with the speed and efficiency that had made Dorne unconquerable throughout its history. But these were not the random raids or defensive actions that had characterized Dornish military involvement in previous conflicts. This was a carefully coordinated campaign designed to strike at the conspiracy's heart. "The wildfire caches in King's Landing," Prince Doran explained as he reviewed maps in his restored solar. "If the Mad King activates them while Robert's forces are besieging the city, the devastation will be beyond imagination. But if those caches can be neutralized before the siege begins, Robert wins a clean victory instead of inheriting ashes," Aldwin finished. The plan that emerged was ambitious to the point of madness, but it had the virtue of attacking the enemy's greatest strength, their patience and long-term thinking, with Dorne's greatest advantage, the ability to strike swiftly and disappear before retaliation could be organized. Aldwin would lead a select force of volunteers north, moving ahead of the main Dornish army to infiltrate King's Landing and neutralize the wildfire threat. Meanwhile, Prince Doran would coordinate with Robert's forces to ensure that when the capital fell, it fell to liberators rather than conquerors. "You understand," the prince said as Aldwin prepared for departure, "that if this plan fails, Dorne will be blamed for whatever catastrophe follows. We're risking everything on the assumption that we can move faster than our enemies can react." "Then we'd better not fail," Aldwin replied, checking his weapons one final time. The ride north was a blur of hard travel and careful planning, as Aldwin's small force, comprised of volunteers from the Golden Company, Dornish specialists, and northern hunters who had sworn themselves to Lysa's service, made their way toward the capital through back roads and forgotten paths. They reached King's Landing as Robert's army was positioning itself for the final siege. But instead of joining the rebel forces, they melted into the city's chaos, like shadows seeking deeper darkness. What followed was 3 days of the most dangerous work Aldwin had ever undertaken. Moving through King's Landing's undercity, guided by maps provided by captured faceless men and intelligence gathered by Lysa's network, they systematically located and neutralized the wildfire caches that would have turned the capital into an inferno. The work was precise, deadly, and absolutely secret. Each cache required different methods. Some could be safely dispersed, others had to be carefully relocated, and a few needed to be destroyed in controlled explosions that were disguised as accidents or enemy action. On the third night, as Robert's forces finally breached the city's walls and began their march toward the Red Keep, Aldwin's team completed their mission. The Mad King's great weapon had been quietly dismantled, one cache at a time, by enemies he never knew existed. When Jaime Lannister killed King Aerys to prevent him from burning the city, he found only empty chambers where the wildfire should have been. The golden-haired knight became known as the Kingslayer for preventing a catastrophe that had already been prevented. His reputation forever stained by an act of heroism that no one could acknowledge. But, in the chaos of victory, few noticed the small group of foreign-looking soldiers who slipped out of King's Landing as quietly as they had entered. Their work was done, their mission complete, and their existence already fading into the kind of legend that historians would dismiss as impossible. The real battle for the Iron Throne had been won not by Robert's hammer or Ned Stark's sword, but by patient intelligence work and surgical strikes that eliminated the enemy's ability to destroy what they could not control. When the celebrations began and the new king claimed his crown, the men and women who had made his victory possible were already riding south, carrying with them the knowledge that the Game of Thrones was far more complex than any song would ever tell. Prince Doran welcomed them back to Sunspear with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose gambit had paid off beyond his greatest hopes. Robert Baratheon was king. The realm was safe, and Dorne had emerged from the conflict stronger than ever. But more importantly, they had proven that the right people, working in shadow and silence, could change the course of history without anyone ever knowing their names. The bastard's crown was invisible, but it was real, and it had just helped save the Seven Kingdoms from enemies they would never know they had faced. Epilogue: The Bastard's Crown. 6 months later, the Great Hall of Sunspear had been restored to its former glory, but the scars of the conspiracy still showed in subtle ways. New faces among the guards, different tapestries on the walls, and an atmosphere of watchful caution that had not existed before the poisoning. Sir Aldwyn Rivers, no longer Rivers, but Aldwyn Martell, legitimized by royal decree and adopted into the princely house of Dorne, stood before the assembled lords of the southern realm and tried not to think about how strange his life had become. The war was over. Robert Baratheon sat the Iron Throne. The Mad King was dead, and the realm was slowly beginning to heal from the wounds of civil conflict. But the victory had come at a cost that few understood, and the true enemy had been defeated by methods that history would never record. "The Volantene conspiracy has been dismantled," Prince Doran announced to the gathering, his voice strong despite the lingering effects of his poisoning. "Their agents have been identified and eliminated, their financial networks disrupted, and their plans for Westeros brought to nothing." Polite applause echoed through the hall, but Aldwyn could see the questions in the Lord's eyes. The official story was that foreign merchants had attempted to profit from the rebellion by playing both sides, a simple matter of greed rather than the complex web of manipulation they had actually uncovered. The truth was far more disturbing and far more dangerous to reveal. 17 faceless men had been operating throughout Westeros, some for years, carefully positioned to influence key decisions and shape the course of events. The Citadel had been compromised at the highest levels, with false maesters feeding misinformation to lords across the Seven Kingdoms. And the gold that had funded both sides of the conflict had come not from simple merchant greed, but from a deliberate attempt to weaken Westeros for eventual conquest. But proving any of that would have required revealing methods and sources that needed to remain secret. So the simplified version would enter the histories, while the truth would be preserved in documents locked away in Sunspear's deepest vaults. "The question now," Prince Doran continued, "is how we ensure that such a conspiracy cannot take root again." That, at least, was a conversation they could have openly. The lords who had gathered in Sunspear represented a new alliance houses that had proven their loyalty during the crisis, men and women who could be trusted with the realm's security. Lady Mira Smallwood. Now Lady Mira Tarley having married into a house that needed strengthening after some of its members had sided with the Targaryens, stood to address the assembly. The frightened girl who had attended a betrothal feast 6 months ago had been replaced by a woman whose intelligence network rivaled any spy master's. The conspiracy succeeded as long as it did because we were looking in the wrong directions, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. We watched for armies and dragons, but ignored the servants who carried our messages and the maesters who advised our decisions. She had been instrumental in rooting out the last of the faceless men, using techniques that Qyburn had taught her, methods that were effective, but too dark to discuss in polite company. We propose the establishment of a new institution, she continued. Not to replace the Citadel, but to watch it. Men and women sworn to preserve the realm's independence, trained to recognize and counter foreign influence. Spies watching spies, Lord Ironwood observed. And who watches the watchers? We all do, Aldwyn said, speaking for the first time since the formal proceedings had begun. That's the point. No single institution, no matter how well-intentioned, can be trusted with absolute authority, but a network of overlapping responsibilities, each checking the others. It was a radical concept for Westeros, where power had traditionally flowed from the top down through clear hierarchies. But the conspiracy had proven that traditional structures could be corrupted, that trusted institutions could be turned against the very realm they were meant to serve. The discussions continued through the afternoon, covering everything from new communication protocols to methods for verifying the identity of key personnel. It was technical work, unglamorous but essential, the kind of detailed planning that prevented future disasters. As evening approached and the formal sessions ended, Aldwyn found himself on the battlements of Sunspear, looking out over the desert that had become his new home. The sun was setting behind distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of the Targaryen colors, but without the fear they had once inspired. Regretting your choice? Lysa Snow, now Lysa Stark, her legitimacy confirmed by royal decree, buttoned him at the wall. Which choice? He asked. Throwing away my old life for principles I barely understood, or accepting a new name from people who used to be my enemies? Both, I suppose. Aldwyn considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, he had been Sir Aldwyn Rivers, bastard knight, in service to a lord who cared more about profit than honor. Now he was Aldwyn Martell, heir to lands and titles he had never dreamed of possessing, married to Nymeria Sand in a political alliance that had surprised everyone, including himself. No regrets, he said finally. The bastard's crown fits better than I expected. It was Dornish humor calling his new position a bastard's crown, because it had been earned through unconventional means rather than inherited through bloodline. But there was truth in it as well. His legitimization and adoption had been political necessities, ways of binding him to Dorne's interests while giving him the authority needed to help rebuild the realm's defenses. The real work is just beginning, Lysa observed. Robert's a good king in his own way, but he doesn't understand the kind of threats we faced. He thinks the war is over, that everything can go back to the way it was. Can it? Some things, perhaps, but not the important things. She leaned against the battlements, her gray eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. We know now that Westeros isn't isolated from the rest of the world. We know that enemies can wear friendly faces, that gold can be as dangerous as steel, and that the Game of Thrones is played on a board far larger than we ever imagined. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of the desert and the distant sound of evening prayers from the city below. Aldwyn found himself thinking about the crossroads where everything had changed, where personal combat had given way to larger battles and simple loyalties had shattered against complex truths. "Do you think we won?" he asked. Lysa was quiet for a long moment. "We survived," she said finally. we exposed enough of the conspiracy to stop it from achieving its goals. We prevented Westeros from being carved up by foreign powers who saw us as nothing more than a market to be exploited. She paused. But winning? That's a longer game than any of us will live to see completed. Movement in the courtyard below caught their attention. A small party of riders was approaching the gates. Not an army or a diplomatic mission, but a handful of travelers seeking shelter for the night. In the old days, such arrivals would have been routine, unremarkable. Now, everyone who entered Sunspear was scrutinized, their identities verified through methods that would have seemed like paranoia before the conspiracy. Maester Donald's people? Aldwin asked. Most likely. He's built quite a network over the past few months. Lysa smiled slightly. It's ironic, in a way. The Citadel tried to maintain neutrality by staying out of politics entirely. Donald maintains neutrality by being involved in everyone's politics equally. The old Maester had indeed created something remarkable, a loose confederation of scholars, servants, and minor nobles who served as the realm's early warning system against foreign infiltration. They called themselves the Grey Rats, adopting the Citadel's old nickname with ironic pride. But their loyalty was to the realm rather than to any institution. Footsteps on the stairs announced another arrival. Captain Jorek now, Sir Jorek, knighted by Robert Baratheon for his service during the war, climbed onto the battlements with the easy stride of a man who had found his place in the world. "The king's reply," he said, handing Aldwin a scroll sealed with the Baratheon stag. Aldwin broke the seal and read quickly, his expression growing more thoughtful with each line. "He's agreed to the new protocols," he said finally. "Communication codes, identity verification, financial oversight of foreign trade. Everything we asked for." "And the price?" Lysa asked, knowing there was always a price. "Dorne provides 2,000 spears for the king's service, along with intelligence about any unusual activity in the eastern kingdoms." Aldwin looked up from the scroll. "He also wants to meet with Prince Doran personally, to discuss what he calls the realm's future security arrangements." Jorek laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. "The king still doesn't entirely understand what we uncovered, does he? He thinks it was all about trade disputes and foreign meddling, not a systematic attempt to conquer Westeros from within." "Better that way," Lysa said pragmatically. "The full truth would panic the realm and create the very instability our enemies were trying to achieve. Sometimes, the comfortable lie serves the realm better than the dangerous truth." They stood in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars appeared overhead. Below them, Sunspear settled into its evening rhythms, guards changing shifts, servants lighting torches, the ordinary business of a great house continuing despite the extraordinary events that had shaped their recent history. "I have news," Jorek said eventually, "from across the narrow sea. The Free Cities are reorganizing their approach to Westeros. The failure of the Volantene conspiracy has convinced them that direct interference is too risky, which means they'll try something else," Aldwin observed. "Eventually, yes, but for now, they're focused on consolidating their own positions and dealing with the power vacuum left by the conspiracy's collapse." Yorek's expression grew more serious. "We bought time, not victory. How we use that time will determine whether our children face the same threats we did." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Nymeria Sand Nymeria Martell now, though she had kept her bastard name out of pride rather than shame. She moved across the battlements with the silent grace that marked her as her father's daughter, her presence transforming the casual gathering into something more formal. "Uncle requests your presence in his solar," she said to Aldwin. "There are matters that require discussion before tomorrow's council meeting." Aldwin nodded, understanding that Prince Doran's requests were rarely simple invitations. "What matters?" "Reports from our friends in the capital," Nymeria replied carefully. It seems that someone has been asking questions about the faceless men, someone with access to information that should be closely held. The implications were troubling. The existence of the faceless men and their role in the conspiracy was known only to a handful of people, all of whom had been carefully vetted and sworn to secrecy. If someone else had learned about them, new threats or old enemies, Lysa asked. Unknown, Nymeria admitted, but Uncle believes it's important enough to warrant immediate attention. They made their way down from the battlements and through corridors that Aldwin was still learning to navigate. 6 months was not enough time to feel entirely at home in Sunspear, though he was beginning to understand why the Dornish were so fiercely protective of their independence. The castle's architecture reflected its people, beautiful but defensive, welcoming but watchful. Prince Doran Solar had been completely redecorated since the poisoning. Every piece of furniture replaced, and every tapestry changed. It was a practical precaution, as much as an aesthetic choice. Too many things in the old Solar might have been touched by enemies. The prince himself looked healthier than he had in months. The last effects of the poison finally purged from his system, but his dark eyes held the weight of responsibilities that had grown heavier rather than lighter since the conspiracy's defeat. "Sit," he said without preamble. "We have much to discuss, and little time to discuss it." He gestured to a table where documents were spread out in careful arrangements, reports from agents throughout the 7 kingdoms, financial records from Old Town's banking houses, and correspondence with lords whose loyalty had been tested and proven. "The questions being asked in King's Landing," Doran began, "come from someone within Robert's inner circle. Someone who knows enough about our recent activities to ask uncomfortable questions, but not enough to understand why those activities were necessary." "Jon Arryn?" Aldwin guessed. "Possibly. Or Stannis Baratheon. Both men have reputations for thoroughness that could prove problematic." Doran picked up one of the reports. "They're investigating the deaths of certain Maesters, trying to determine if there was a pattern. If they push hard enough, they might uncover information that we've worked very hard to keep hidden." The dilemma was clear. The methods they had used to identify and eliminate the faceless men had often been brutal, necessary, but difficult to justify to those who hadn't faced the same threats. Qyburn's compound, in particular, had effects that could be mistaken for torture or murder by anyone who didn't understand its purpose. "What do you recommend?" Nymeria asked. "Controlled revelation," Doran replied. "We provide enough truth to satisfy their curiosity, while concealing the details that must remain secret. A carefully crafted explanation that serves the realm's interests while protecting our methods." It was vintage Dornish strategy complex, subtle, and designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. But it would require careful execution and considerable trust from all parties involved. "I'll draft the report," Lysa offered. "My position as a Stark bastard who was present during key events gives me credibility, while my distance from Dorne's political interests makes me seem more objective. And I'll deliver it," Aldwin added. "As Dorne's representative, but also as someone who served Northern Lords, I can speak to both perspectives." Prince Doran nodded approvingly. "Good, but remember, we're not just protecting our own actions. We're protecting the realm's ability to defend itself against future threats. The methods we developed, the networks we built, the knowledge we gained, all of it must be preserved for those who come after us." As they worked through the details of their response, Aldwin found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that night at Stonehenge. Then, he had been a bastard knight whose greatest ambition was to earn a small holding and a measure of respect. Now he was helping to shape the future security of the 7 kingdoms. The bastard's crown, as he had come to think of it, carried responsibilities he could never have imagined. But it also offered opportunities to ensure that the realm he served would be stronger and safer than the one he had inherited. The work continued late into the night, as it had every night for months, and would continue for months to come. The Game of Thrones never ended. It simply evolved, presenting new challenges that required new solutions. But as Aldwyn looked around the table at his companions, a Dornish prince, a bastard daughter of Winterfell, a sellsword turned knight, and the woman who had become his wife in a match that defied every convention of noble marriage, he felt something he had never experienced as Sir Aldwyn Rivers. He felt like he belonged. The bastard had found his crown, and the realm was safer for it. Outside Sunspear's ancient walls, the desert stretched away toward distant horizons where new threats might even now be taking shape. But inside the castle, in a solar lit by lamplight and warmed by the presence of allies who had become family, the future was being written by those who had earned the right to hold the pen. The conspiracy had been defeated, but the work of protecting the realm would never end. And perhaps that was as it should be. Not a single great victory, but an endless series of small ones, won by people who understood that honor was not about noble birth or ancient names, but about the willingness to sacrifice for something larger than oneself. The game continued. The board had changed. And for the first time in his life, Aldwyn Martell was playing to win not just for himself, but for everyone.